on Zoom, there will be a chat box option. We're not going to close that in just for questions, and then I will be handing over those questions to people during the Q&A session. There will be a chat box option. We're not going to close that in just for questions, and then I will be handing over those questions to people during the Q&A session. There will be a chat box option. We're not going to close that in just for questions, and then I will be handing over those questions to people during the Q&A session. There will be a chat box option.
Anyway, your line is
We're not
quite
going to
bad.
close that in just for questions, and then I will be handing over those questions to people during the Q&A session. There will be a chat box
Anyway, your line is
We're not
quite
going to close
bad.
that in just for
I can't hear her.
No, it's in a loop. I think that she's sorry, comrades. Yeah, and she's stuck in the void there.
I can't hear her.
No, it's in a loop. I think that she's sorry, comrades. Yeah, and she's stuck in the void there.
I can't hear her.
No, it's in a loop. I think that she's sorry, comrades. Yeah, and she's stuck in the void there.
Do you have a backup system, ma'am? Because it looks like there's an echo, and when we speak, we are delayed.
Yeah, I think it's fine now. I wasn't even speaking, so I don't know what was going on. I just only spoken the first time, but I will be on mute the entire session, so I won't be causing any disruption. I actually thought the YouTube had went live. Maybe that was the problem. But yeah, in conclusion, everyone can unmute and mute themselves. We'll be feeding due to some of the questions during the Q&A session. Zakira, I don't know if maybe you want to add something.
No, thanks, Tediwe and Dudu. I think we covered. I think it's just to all of us that when we let in people, we will be muting everyone. So Tediwe, that's from your side. And then if you start speaking again, Dudu, just remember to unmute because you will be muted as well.
Okay.
Yes,
No
that's
problem.
right. Sorry, I think the issue was coming from me. I had the live stream on YouTube on, so I've muted that. That's why there was the whole repetition of voices. That was my fault.
Okay.
Are you all hearing me well? Is everything fine and there isn't like background noise?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
So, okay, everything is set. The YouTube is working fine. And I think we can start admitting people into the Zoom call, and then we can get started in 2 minutes.
Okay.
Consent to be announced. Are there more people that are being let in?
Yeah.
We're going to start in the meantime. I think it's fine. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to part 1 of a 3-webinar series on the findings of the State Capture Report. My name is Duduetsang Meti. I'm the Communications Officer for the Defend Our Democracy campaign. And with me, we as a campaign are very grateful for Rebecca Davis from Daily Maverick, Hennie van Vuuren from Open Secrets, and for Reverend Frank Chikane, a convener of the Defend Our Democracy campaign, for their willingness in wanting to present today and sit in this panel. So I will just quickly give an introductory remark and perhaps just touch on the objectives of what it is we want to do with this webinar series. And basically, this is the first one of 3, and it will follow after each release of the State Capture Report. We will have a webinar series trying to unpack what each report talks about and what its findings are about. And our main purpose is, to allow those who haven't had a chance to read the report to get a sense of what the recommendations are, to get a sense of, what the findings are, and just exactly confirm to oneself that, we really were captured. And we are going to go through, Rebecca Davis in particular is going to take us through just a brief overview of the report. Hennie van Vuuren from Open Secrets is going to take us through the role of big corporate in the state capture project and some of the implications in their role and how they can be kept accountable for their contribution to state capture. And then Reverend Frank Chikane is going to give us a political context of where it is we find ourselves in South Africa and what is at stake at the moment within the political sphere as it pertains to state capture. Right, so while the report speaks of capture and corruption that also has already occurred, its lessons must also be applied to deal with current forms of state capture, which of course the report has not or does not deal with. But we get a sense of what capture is. We already know how we can identify it. And the report is very great at giving us recommendations on how to prevent capture. And so we have tools and resources to somewhat identify it and remedy it and prevent it. And in so doing, one of the things that we want to be in a position of as civil society and interested organizations and members of the public, is figure out ways in which we can rebuild state capacity and entrench public oversight, be it at the NPA, within SOEs, and at a municipal level, a level of government that oftentimes we forget also has its own kind of capture and corruption. And then also think about how corruption in many ways affects us as ordinary citizens in this country. So maybe let's start with you, Rebecca. Can you give us an overview of the report and its findings? And what is it that are key aspects of the report that civil society and the public in general can get as takeaways from the report?
Thanks so much, Dudu. I'm honored to be in this company, and thank you so much for all the valuable work that the Defend Our Democracy campaign has been doing. As Dudu mentioned, for reasons of time, I'm going to give a really kind of high-level whistle-stop tour of the first installment of the State Capture Report, focusing mainly on the findings and the recommendations. I hope you'll all also forgive me if, in the interest of time, I refer to Judge Raymond Zondo as Zondo. I know that In the recent past, it was considered quite offensive to refer to a judge in the media simply by his surname, but I suppose that was also before we realized the full range of ways in which judges' dignity could be impugned. So the state capture report we now know will be released in 3 installments. The first installment of which was released in early January after it had been handed to President Cyril Ramaphosa. We expect the second in early February, the beginning of February, and the third at the beginning of March. And President Ramaphosa has committed to submitting the full report to Parliament by the 30th of June this year, with an indication of, and I quote, his intentions with regard to implementation of the Commission's recommendations. And government has also indicated that it is not going to be formally or officially commenting on the findings until the full report has been released. So we believed that the State Capture Commission staff were initially working on 6 work streams, as they call them, and that was Eskom, Transnet, SABC, Denel, SAA and SAA Technical, and other matters. But when Judge Zondo applied for an extension for the Commission's work in December, it appeared that there were in fact now 17 work streams. The first installment of the report is 874 pages with no summary. And Judge Zondo acknowledges in the introduction that this is in some ways undesirable. He says, though, that it has not been possible to produce a summary, I assume for reasons of time and human resources. But he also says they want people to understand the state capture report in the full context of its findings. So from that perspective, it is also something of a strategic move on the part of the Commission. I think it's also important to note, and I haven't seen a lot of mention of this in media reporting on it, that Zondo states unequivocally in the introduction that a reading of Part 1 on its own establishes that state capture has been concluded, but that only in Part 3 will the reasons for this be given. So the report that we currently have is dealing with SAA and SAA Technical, the Gupta's newspaper, The New Age, the South African Revenue Service, SARS, and general recommendations made by the Commission on public procurement and the issues with that particular system. And in this first report, by far the most extensive findings and recommendations are with regards to SAA and SAA Technical. I would say that the most scathing assessments of any individual within this first report are given to the former SAA chair, Dudu Myeni, and her colleague / henchwoman, Yake Kwinana. And Zondo finds that these two in particular operated with negligence, incompetence, and deliberate corrupt intent. And I should say that the wording throughout this first report is what we've come to associate, I would say, with Judge Zondo throughout the Commission's 4 years, which is to say sober, meticulous, but also not in any way reluctant to use scathing criticism where he considers it appropriate. And there are a number of instances in which we see this in the first report. With regards to SAA and SAA Technical, he suggests a more or less direct line can be drawn between some of Myeni's decisions in particular and the shambolic state of South African Airways' finances now, years down the line, which is quite significant, I think. The work on South African Airways also produced the most extensive list of individuals and companies that the NPA should consider prosecuting for fraud and corruption. In general, in this first installment, there are around 20 individuals who Zondo says the NPA should consider, and in some cases strongly consider, prosecuting. And the bulk of them are found in the work stream dealing with SAA and SAA Technical. And they're split pretty much evenly, in this case, between the public and private sector, including civil servants in key positions at SAA and SAA Technical in posts such as head of procurement, business people who made dodgy deals, which is to say JM Aviation, and perhaps particularly the executives at Regiment's Capital, of which Eric Wood is, I think, the best known name, and even 2 Nedbank executives. I haven't yet seen Nedbank make an official statement on that, but I might have missed it. The biggest name recommended for prosecution in this work stream is Dudu Myeni. The second part of the report deals with the South African Revenue Services, SARS, and Zondo finds here that the version of events in which the former revenue head Tom Moyane and executives from the consulting company Bain & Co., particularly Vittorio Mazzone, essentially plotted to strip SARS of talented staff and squander its investigative capacity. He finds that that version of events is essentially correct. He also expresses astonishment that a company like Bain, which had no evident expertise or experience in the restructuring of a tax service anywhere in the world, should have been granted such leeway. And it's also with regards to SARS, of course, that he deals with the so-called rogue unit, which he is satisfied has been unequivocally revealed to be bogus, and the Sunday Times' reporting in this regard also comes in for criticism. It's also here that he deals with the ding-dong, to put it colloquially, between Cabinet Minister Pravin Gordhan and Tom Moyane. He expresses, how should I put it, unhappiness with Moyane's accusations that Gordhan is racist, but also says that in general, the back and forth between them did not do much to enhance the understanding of the issues at play. The to-do list for the NPA when it comes to SARS is shorter and also vaguer. So for instance, Zondo states that individuals involved with the awarding of contracts to Bain & Co. should be charged with corruption, but there is not a clear reference as to who he intends that to mean. Tom Moyane, in addition, is earmarked as potentially eligible for being charged with perjury relating to false evidence Moyane gave to Parliament. But he makes no bones, I would say, about his findings with regards to Moyane and Bain, that these are the two villains, to use a simplistic term, when it came to the gutting of the South African Revenue Service. Moving on to the findings about the Gupta newspaper, The New Age, Zondo found that there was no evidence that any state-owned enterprise which entered into contracts of any kind, be they called sponsorships or advertisements or whatever, with The New Age received any worthwhile returns. It's also here that he dealt with the troubling case of Themba Maseko, who's the former government communication and information systems head, who was moved out of position and replaced with Jimmy Manyi, and Zondo makes it quite clear that he believes that that was the doing of former President Jacob Zuma rather than Zuma's claims to the contrary. And I'll speak a bit more about the findings as regards Zuma in a second. The list of the people the NPA should consider prosecuting with regards to The New Age gives us the first and only recommendation relating to a member of the Gupta family in this first report. He suggests that Tony Gupta should potentially be prosecuted on the basis of evidence from the former SAA CEO, Vuyisile Khona, that Gupta offered him a bribe initially of 100,000 and later 500,000. Former Transnet CEO Brian Molefe is also fingered for fraud and or contravention of the PFMA, and the members of the Eskom board in 2015 and the former Eskom CEO Colin Machila. But certainly the two standout names in that NPA list would be Tony Gupta and Brian Molefe. Perhaps slightly unexpectedly, this report also considered the general problems with the public procurement system and recommendations on how that could be reformed. There are quite a large number of suggested reforms, but I think the two most critical ones are that Zondo recommends the creation of an anti-corruption agency dealing with public procurement, which would include a 5-member council, an inspectorate, a litigation unit, a tribunal, and a court. And that he also recommends the strengthening of protection for whistleblowers, including allowing them to financially benefit from disclosures, as is the case in many other parts of the world. And it should be noted too that Zondo throughout this first report gives enormous praise to the courage of those whistleblowers who did stand up, such as Cynthia Stimple at SAA and of course Themba Maseko himself, and also notes with some sorrow the rareness of this within the whole story of state capture. Moving on to what Zondo's commission seems to have identified in this first report as the key structural problems leading to state capture. which I've summarized in a few points. First of all, the unnecessary use of external service providers by state-owned enterprises, which he said allowed often for corruption to flourish, particularly when the services they were carrying out were in fact able to be carried out quite adequately within the SOE itself. Secondly, that the use of private sector auditors should be avoided wherever possible, and that the Auditor General should be given more resources so that it can carry out the necessary audits of SOEs. And of course, the standout example here is of SAA, where private sector auditors, including PwC, gave it a clean bill of health for 5 years, despite, in retrospect, clear evidence of corruption and fraud at the time. Whistleblowers, as mentioned, he finds need more protection. Fourthly, that state capture could not have flourished as it did if there were not compliant individuals in key places. And we have also found through the commission, and this is also mentioned in the report, that the appointments of boards of SOEs, for instance, would have had to go through the ANC's now controversial cadre deployment committee. Fifthly, that the ideals of Black economic empowerment were abused when it came to public procurement, although he does note that their ideals are indeed worthy within the South African context. Sixthly, that the boards of state-owned enterprises often exhibited a really shocking failure to lead. That there was too much ministerial and presidential interference at state-owned enterprises, and that in general, as mentioned, the public procurement system has major structural weaknesses. Then finally, what are the gaps so far? So I just want to make one comment from the media's perspective, which is it's very difficult for individual journalists to assess the comprehensiveness of Judge Zondo's findings as a whole if you haven't been covering every day of the commission from its start, which was almost never the case as far as I understand. Certainly at my own media organization, it wasn't, just because it was basically impossible for that to happen. So many of us have expertise in certain areas, but it is hard to know just as a whole how comprehensive these findings and the assessment of evidence actually is. What many members of the public will have noted, perhaps with alarm, are the gaps as regards findings so far against the Gupta family and the former president, Jacob Zuma. As I mentioned, only one member of the Gupta family, Tony Gupta, is earmarked specifically for trying to offer one bribe. We should note, of course, that this is just the first report. There will be 2 more. And I also understand it as being very plausible that Judge Zondo wants to keep his gunpowder dry, so to speak, when it comes to the former president, particularly given the political sensitivities around that. So it's to be imagined that there will be concrete findings against Jacob Zuma, I think, in probably the 3rd report. However, there were a few occasions on which Judge Zondo did make certain findings against Zuma, although there is no direct recommendation yet that he should be prosecuted for state capture. For a start, there are, at a few places, there are hints to that effect from context. For instance, he says that the people responsible for gathering funds for the Jacob Zuma Foundation for the benefit of Jacob Zuma and Dudu Myeni should be prosecuted, without giving details as to who those individuals are. Zondo has very harsh words for Jacob Zuma's conduct as regards the commission and his refusal eventually to appear before it, saying that he fled the commission because he knew he would not be able to answer key questions. Zondo also finds that state security agency resources were abused for Zuma's benefit and that of Dudu Myeni, that Jacob Zuma played a critical role in the capture of the South African Revenue Service in collaboration with Tom Moyane, and that Themba Maseko was indeed removed from the GCIS on Zuma's say-so. And Zondo says, in fact, that Zuma's account here, where Zuma attempted to blame the deceased Minister Collins Chabane for Maseko's lateral move, was a complete fabrication, which also raises the question, given that there are a couple of other instances in which Zondo almost outright says a witness has lied, that he rejects their evidence. It raises the question on whether these witnesses could be prosecuted for perjury as well, given that the Zondo Commission has the same judicial status in this regard as a court, as in you are speaking under oath and are expected to tell the truth accordingly. That's it from now for me for now, Dudu, but I am happy to obviously clarify anything that needs clarifying. If you have complex technical financial questions, I urge you to save them for Hennie. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that brief overview. And I think the main takeaway is that, you know, contrary to at one point, the belief being that, you know, state capture is a hoax and it is not something, or it is fictions of our imagination. It is quite important to take away that it did happen, and that at some point we really need to get those who were implicated in the report to account, to be prosecuted and to possibly face arrest. And I think this brings us to the next point. Hennie, if you can take us through, what is it that, you know, big corporate did in its contribution towards state capture? How bad was it? And maybe if you can talk about how the public can, you know, ensure that even big corporate, outside of wanting to only hold those implicated from the public sector side, how do we make sure that those implicated in the report from big corporate side are also held to account? And in instances, for instance, like mechanisms put in place by organizations like BLSA and BUSA, how do we strengthen those to make sure that those participating in business in South Africa and business within the public sector can do so in an ethical manner?
Great, Dudetsan, thanks very much. Greetings, comrades, everybody on the call. I'm going to try and take you through 3 or 4 big areas that you've identified. So please just do stop me if I'm repeating myself or going over time, Dudetsan. But I think the first point you raise is around those who are implicated, and Rebecca's taken us through, I think, many of the individuals, the politicians who are implicated, but what's really important is the extent to which the report does what we needed to do to name some of the companies in this first installment of the report that were implicated in, particularly in SAA and SARS, and to an extent within the new age. What it does as well, I think, is it starts to correct the misperception that corruption is just a problem of the public sector quite clearly. And I think as South Africans and many other people around the globe are, I think are increasingly become conscious of that there is a system of corruption, of economic crime that takes place, and that relies heavily on legitimate corporations to play a part in that machinery. And that was very clear, I think, during the state capture project, that the system relied on corporations, and those corporations themselves remain very active within our economy in many ways. And so I think it's very important for us not only to draw lessons, but to recognize the names of those companies and find ways in which we ensure that companies like those don't repeat that kind of conduct, and of course that we hold those particular companies to account. And I guess from our side, it's I mean, just firstly the recognition that both PwC and Bain played a central role in the gutting of SAA and SARS. So I think Deputy Chief Justice Zondo is very clear that without the help of those two corporations, without the help of PricewaterhouseCoopers and Bain, I don't think we would have seen the gutting on the scale that we saw of both of those corporations. There are also some significant recommendations that are made, particularly against Bain, and not only Bain, but also against Nedbank. And so Nedbank is implicated in the SAA section of the report, and where it is identified as assisting the company regiments to be able to make money off interest rate swaps. So there was that was particularly focused on the airports company of South Africa. And we saw Nedbank profiting from those deals. And it is not the only time that we'll hear from Nedbank. We anticipate Nedbank featuring large in, I'm not sure if it's the second or the third installment of the report, which will focus on Transnet. Because what Nedbank did with regiments, we believe, and which is now being confirmed by Deputy Chief Justice Zondo in the first report with the airports company in South Africa, played itself out on a far bigger scale in terms of Transnet, which netted regiments an amount of about 750 million rand. And if I recall correctly, Nedbank a fee of about 78 million rand that they made off that. So those are important recommendations when we start to look at the culpability of banks. Standard Bank is mentioned as well, and they are probably, there's less complicity in this particular instance when it comes to the role of Standard Bank. But importantly, the report at least does say that Nedbank should now be investigated and potentially be prosecuted for its role in these dubious interest rate swaps, which it was really part and parcel of engineering together with the Gupta-linked regiments company. And then I think obviously importantly as well is the collusion which Rebecca spoke to between Tom Moyane, Jacob Zuma, and of course Bain, which has been the subject of discussion in the media for the last while. The three of these parties together acted in a premeditated manner. They planned the destruction of the South African Revenue Service through the so-called restructuring project. And their real intention as a corporation working together with a civil servant, Tom Moyane, and with a politician, Jacob Zuma, was to dismantle SARS. And we always want to add there, the dismantling of SARS was very often in the interest of other big corporations because they knew they would not have to pay tax. It was, of course, illicit tobacco dealers and a whole range of other crooks, but some of the crooks who benefited from the disabling of the South African Revenue Service, of course, also included the corporations who knew that if SARS doesn't have the ability to be able to pursue them in the way they were able to do more doggedly under previous administrations, they could basically get away with doing what big corporations do around the world, and that's pay as little tax as possible with little interest in the consequence in terms of trying to achieve elements of social justice in a country like ours. And so, I think while we'd argue that there are some things that the report certainly does get right, we still believe that there's some things that it has, it's missed opportunities. And one of those opportunities, that comes out is really around the auditors. And I think that the auditors are still largely unaccountable. So the report goes to name the role that PricewaterhouseCoopers or PwC played together with its partner, the auditing firm Konki, in terms of the financial irregularities that we saw at South African Airways. But what it doesn't do is it doesn't make any recommendations against them. And so this is the kind of thing where you scratch your head and wonder, well, how can you say these people did something wrong and then don't tell us what the recommendation is? Now, if anyone is listening who's on the drafting team for Deputy Chief Justice Zondo, I do hope they remind him of this, what we see as an omission, and maybe that's something that can be corrected in one of the follow-up versions, not follow-up versions, but in one of the next installments of the report, because it certainly doesn't make sense not to do that. And equally, I think what we would see as a bit of a miss is that the report makes a recommendation that Tom Moyane should face perjury charges in terms of the destruction of South African Revenue Service. Given the seriousness of those crimes, we would argue that the criminal charges that he should be facing should be much steeper, and equally that Bain should face criminal charges instead of an only investigation. There's sufficient information that's available right now to try and hold those companies to account. So I think on the first reading, I think one has good reason to at least be optimistic that some of the companies have been named. There are going to be many others that will follow, McKinsey, amongst the consulting companies, Deloitte and the other auditing companies, no doubt, and all of the banks, FNB, Standard Bank, and certainly Nedbank, again, we'll hear more of them in the next installments of the report. But it begs the question, if there was a commitment from the side of Chief Justice Zondo, why didn't we see the CEOs of the banks hauled before the commission in order to hold them to account? And maybe that brings me to the next point, or not sufficient interrogation of them, was your question around accountability and what can be done to hold these entities accountable, both in terms of the public and what we should be seeing from the side of the state. And I think the first point to again stress is that it's not only about the public sector. It is about us recognizing the incredibly important role that private corporations like these play in state capture and corruption. Just today, Transparency International, the International Anti-Corruption Day, releases its annual list of what's called a corruption perception index. So where countries are ranked according to perceptions mostly of business people and of so-called experts from the global north who look at countries around the world and rank them according to their perceived levels of corruption. And as usual, all the African countries are at the bottom of the pile. This year, many African countries feature even further down that list than they have previously. But what is important to recognize is that there are probably 3 or 4 countries in the top 10 cleanest countries in that list that are all tax havens. They include countries like Luxembourg, Switzerland, to extent Netherlands, a country like Denmark that's been is the country where the biggest money laundering scandal of recent years, a 2 trillion rand, or 4 trillion rand rather, money laundering scandal took place involving a big Danish bank called Danske Bank. And so the point I'm trying to make is that I don't think we are willing yet to sufficiently recognize how systemic many of these crimes are and the extent to which we rely on global corporations and the extent to which we rely on countries that are complicit in this, as long as these countries are constantly rewarded as being clean, whereas they are really part and parcel of that problem. So maybe that's just the first point in terms of changing the narrative and why that's important, and hopefully this leads us in that direction. But I certainly don't think that the Commission's report takes us far enough. And then in terms of accountability, Rebecca outlined many of the key recommendations in terms of public procurement and others, and I'm not going to repeat that, Dudetsang, but I think an important point that the Commission makes is the idea of what's called deferred prosecution agreements. Now, it's hailed as a kind of a novel way for us to ensure that we can hold big companies to account. And what that basically is it's a system that works and has been working for some time, or been deployed for some time in the United Kingdom and in the United States, where big companies basically enter into secret deals with their departments of justice or ministries of justice in their country or state institutions, admit that they've been doing some wrong and pay back big fines. And it all sounds great. Money comes back into the fiscus and we all think we've done a good thing. And I fear that in making this recommendation, the Zondo Commission has potentially failed us, because they've given us an example of the worst kind of practice that's employed in the United States and the United Kingdom, because those deals have largely created cycles of impunity. We look at big banks like HSBC, which is likely implicated, particularly in the Transnet and other deals, because of the way in which they aided and abetted the Gupta network, as well potentially as other terror networks in moving money across the globe that was linked to Gupta money, as we heard at the Zondo Commission, that particular bank factors in these fines into its balance sheet. They would pay off very happily a fine, if I remember correctly, of a fine of, let's just say, many millions of dollars for assisting drug cartels in Mexico, which have resulted in the murder of many hundreds of people in Mexico. But within a couple of years, they were found to be doing exactly the same thing in other countries. And so I think the notion of deferred prosecutions are a mistake. And I don't think that they're going to be helpful as long as they are secret deals that are entered between corporations and the state. And I don't see the imagination, particularly lacking from the National Prosecuting Authority, to offer us anything else. And I do worry that Chief Justice Zondo has sent the wrong message with regard to that. Dudetsang, if I may, you've asked a couple of questions. So can I just tackle your next question, which I think was one really around the role of, if I remember correctly, the role of organized business and the professional bodies, if I'm right.
And yes, please go ahead.
And there, I think we've seen much news in the last week, particularly when it comes to the membership of BAIN. So we've obviously described the role of BAIN in the gutting of the South African Revenue Service. And much of that, of course, was also, it was known through the work of the Nugent Commission and has been affirmed by the Zondo Commission. And so the response has been, well, why is BAIN still a member, or has been readmitted as a member of business's chief lobby organization, Business Leadership South Africa? They were kicked or suspended at one point, let back into the fold, and then last week, in this very curious thing, they were allowed to exit, to voluntarily resign, despite Business Leadership South Africa kicking up a fuss And I think we recall the interview with the CEO of the organization last week saying that we should rather focus on Jacob Zuma. And I guess we should focus on Jacob Zuma. We should focus on many individuals, but we should be focusing on the role of those corporations. I think we need to recognize that the problem, at least when it comes to the industry bodies, is that these are lobby groups for the interests of big corporations. Now, I think what we saw with the example of Bain is that the interests of Bain is, the interests of BLSA, or Business Leadership South Africa, is to ensure that its corporations do well. And I think that for too long, corporations have been doing too well at the expense of the South African people. We see that in the levels of inequality in our society. And I don't think that an organization like that has the ability properly to correct. And I think we need to treat them as lobbyists for big capital, and some of that would be criminal capital, quite frankly, because we've seen the crooked nature of some of the corporations that are implicated. Look at the leadership of Business Leadership South Africa. We've got Mike Brown, who's the Deputy Chair of Business Leadership South Africa. He was CEO at Nedbank from 2010 until now. So he was there right throughout the state capture period, but he's appointed as a director by Business Leadership South Africa in 2019. His company is complicit in state capture. Lungisa Fuzile, a respected public servant of many years. I'm not suggesting he's implicated in state capture. He sits on the board of that organization, but he's also the CEO of Standard Bank South Africa, who are implicated. And the list can go on. Shirley Machaba, CEO of PricewaterhouseCoopers, she's on the board. And so I guess the point being, I don't necessarily see these industry bodies, and I'm not being cynical at all, but I think we need to see these in particular interests, and I guess these are class interests as well that these organizations represent. And I don't think, particularly as civil society, we should be sitting back and hoping that deliverance will come from bodies representing the interests, if you like, of mega capital. I think we've been wooed into this idea during the state capture period that when organizations are funded by these types of movements, our goals are necessarily the same, and I do question whether that's the case. When it comes to the professional bodies, the South African Institute of Chartered Accountants definitely has to do more. The one recommendation was that Yaki Quinana, who Rebecca spoke of previously, who was the chartered accountant who is linked to all of the wrongdoing that took place at South African Airways, that her status as a CA should be stripped. But I think, I think that it is certainly, there is going to be a need for a much wider review of a range of other auditors in particular, and looking at the standards which auditing companies are required to operate in. SAICA for too long as an industry body merely sat by while they watched much of this wrongdoing take place. And so that, together with the other regulatory body, IRBA and others, I think have all been complicit in what we've seen take place. And I think some of the leadership we've seen from people like Freeman Umvalo at SAICA are helpful, but we need to see, I think, a much stronger proactive manner in which auditors and accountants are dealt with who are implicated in one way or another in terms of state capture. And then maybe to make the last point briefly, Diletsang, is this question about what is the role of civil society. I'd like to make 2 points, if I can here. The one is something which the Zondo Commission doesn't do in its first report, and which we hope it will do at a later point, is it doesn't speak to the social cost of state capture. Now, it's all good and well for us to focus on the perpetrators, which we must, but I think firstly, we need to say that state captures come at a massive cost to the people of South Africa. We don't hear the voices of those people in the Zondo Commission's report, and I think we need to better articulate the impact that state capture has had and continues to have on governance in our country and on the lives of working people. We only need to think about the destruction of PRASA, for example, to think of what that's meant in terms of people's ability simply to be able to get to work safely every morning and home again in the evening. And then the second issue is about the National Prosecuting Authority, because moving forward, it's going to be the NPA's job to prosecute. And right now, I think we see not only a lackluster response, but I think we see a National Prosecuting Authority that's in a deep crisis. My understanding is that while many of us within that first week of the year had read the Zondo Commission report, from what I've heard from multiple sources, that the leadership of the National Prosecuting Authority was still struggling to read the report. I think it talks to a fact that the National Director of Public Prosecutions and her team, very well-paid individuals, are not taking the issue of state capture seriously enough. We've seen the resignation of Hermione Cronje as the head of the independent or the investigative directorate, who's tasked with tackling state capture. It seems to suggest again that there are big structural problems within the NPA. We haven't seen a sufficient number of prosecutions, and for a long time, we and a number of other civil society organizations have argued that we've got to give these folks time. They're dealing with an entrenched culture of allowing impunity to prevail, which had been set up over years. But there's I think we can only allow a free pass for so long. That time has now come to an end. I don't think that there is a seriousness. And maybe the last point to make there is the response from the NPA to what they heard. And they have been following the work of the Zondo Commission. They've had an official who has been designated just to follow the goings on of the Zondo Commission. They've had access to some of the evidence, was to tell us that they're going to put in place a task team. Task team, we don't know whether that task team even has a mandate. And so I think, frankly, that is the NPA leadership kicking for touch, because they are so unfortunately out at sea that they don't have a plan right now. And that brings us right back to the first point, Dudetsang. If we want to tackle not only very powerful politicians, but big corporations, we are going to need an NPA that's back in the leadership seat. And I think that is missing right now. And our role within civil society is not to play nicely with institutions, state institutions who are failing us, like the National Prosecuting Authority, but rather to appropriately apply that pressure. We need them to succeed if we're going to break these cycles of impunity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hennie, for your contribution around the role of big business in the state capture project. And perhaps maybe just to summarize for those who just joined, Rebecca took us through the overview of the report itself. What is it that, us as ordinary members of society, as well as civil society, can take away from the report? And then Hennie gave us, a very broad overview of, big corporates' role in the state capture project, mechanisms in which we can hold them to account, given, given the amount of damage that they've done. He also talked about how civil society can get involved in getting the answers, getting the accountability, and possibly and hopefully getting people prosecuted and arrested. And he also gave us, just like a very brief or something to think about, the social cost of capture. How did it affect you as an ordinary citizen? If you at one point were using a taxi to get to work and could no longer afford to use a taxi and wanted to opt to use trains, were you able to do that as a result? What happened to our railway systems and our locomotives, and just the sheer destruction of public infrastructure? Like, how does that trickle down to you as an ordinary South African? And he located it quite well. He also gave us, a global overview of how big corporations across the world have a way in which they practice that is questionable and unethical. And this, I think, has summarized quite broadly how state capture is pervasive in the way that it functioned and possibly continues to function. And that it's quite disturbing how it was able to do what it was able to do and really loot and plunder South Africa's public purse in the way that it did. So with that in mind, I'm going to ask Reverend Frank to step in and perhaps give us the political context and the implications of the state capture report from a political perspective. And I'll just briefly say something that, although 1 month into the year of 2022, many things have happened. Parliament was gutted by fire. There was a break-in at the Constitutional Court. There's been fierce debate around issues related to the Constitution and the rule of law, burglaries at 2 homes of whistleblowers, Themba Maseko as well as Johan Loftrenberg. And, this year has also seen a lot of political parties involved in trying to reverse the Political Party Funding Act, and an attempt to shift blame for the country's socioeconomic woes through the attack on migrants who themselves are often impoverished. And so when we anticipate the second or the 2 reports that are to come from the Zondo Commission, what can we expect? And what is the role of the public and civil society around these political issues that we find ourselves in at the moment? Rev Frank, can you step in?
Thank you very much, ma'am. I would like to thank my colleagues for addressing the issues they've addressed before I speak. And just say thank you for analyzing the report and the weaknesses and the challenges. What I would like to do is to deal with 3 things, really. One is that state capture is a threat to our democracy. And 2 is the damage this has done to the confidence of the people in the state and government institutions. And that on its own is a threat to our democracy. And what we need to do to make sure that those who planned to capture the state do not succeed. And so firstly, I would like to say that the state, the way in which the state was captured, and it's quite clear from even this preliminary report, I mean, the first part of the report, that the intention was to capture strategic organs of the state, the CEOs, the state-owned entities, critical, and the security establishment. And in the security establishment in particular, the focus was mainly on the state security agency in terms of retooling it to serve the interests of the president, his family, and those who were together with him in the state capture project. In my view, and I hope that ultimately the other reports will accumulate and reach that conclusion that what happened actually was a treasonable act. In my view, if a foreigner came and captured your intelligence services, you take it as treason, or any other ordinary person. And I must say we are lucky that this did not wholly succeed and it was stopped. Otherwise, we're going to be forcefully turned back to a fascist regime with a dictatorship, which we wouldn't do much about because they would have amassed the power to kill our people. Indeed, the whistleblowers are being killed, and those who stand for the truth are being killed, and would have reached a stage where none of us would be able to do anything about it. Secondly, is that state capture destabilizes the state and hollows it out, as the evidence shows, so that it can allow looting without any consequences. In our statement, the founding statement of the Defend Our Democracy, we talked about industrial scale looting. And that looting, as the previous speaker has talked about, then impoverishes the people and makes us poorer than we were, especially the poor. And that creates a possibility of destabilization of the country, because if the majority of the people are not employed, then you have got instability. But those who were leading this ideological onslaught to justify state capture present it as if it is in the interest of the poor. And I just want to quote this old man, because during the elections last year, this old man was interviewed about elections. And he said that those we elect into power loot and serve their interest. And he used an ordinary language, peasant's language, to say they feast whilst we die of hunger. And that's why I'm not going to vote. And so that brings me to the issue of the damage to our democracy and confidence, that when the leaders, especially when it starts from the president down, loot the coffers of the state and nothing happens to them, then it means everybody else can be lawless. That's why crime increases and people thieve and steal, because if the people in the state who are supposed to keep law and order are in fact responsible for it, people lose confidence in the rule of law, in public institutions, and the democratic processes. That's why some said we're not going to vote. And that's a damage to our democracy. And I think it's important that people know that the law applies to everybody, not just to the poor. If a poor person steals an orange in a supermarket, they get charged immediately and sent to jail. But those who are powerful and rich never go to jail. And that brings me to the third part of this loss of confidence, that those who looted the state developed a war chest. And this war chest, it's not just for their own interest in terms of wealth, but it is to make sure they don't go to jail. And they're going to keep us busy in the courts until we give up. Because look at some of the cases that have been dragging on for years. The justice system can't just bring it to an end and say, this thing must come to an end. This person has committed a crime and must go to jail. The war chest also is meant for destabilization, as our program director said. Threaten us with destabilization, death and destruction, and we don't know what some of these incidents come from. But indeed, people fear that people want to destabilize this country. They did make announcements last year that they were going to do it. And so the money that has been accumulated, it's also to make sure that they go into power to govern us. And I would like to conclude actually by referring to the statement, a paragraph in the statement we used to launch the commission, because the point is, if people have no respect for the Constitution, no respect for the law, because you can't do what they did, it's illegal to do what has been done to the State Security Agency. It is against the Constitution, in fact. And those who are against the Constitution and the law, and there's this campaign that has unfolded recently to create a climate where you can't act on the commission because people are told the Constitution is not important and the law is not critical. So in that statement we adopted when we launched the DOD, we said our people fought for and chose constitutional democracy as a bulwark against fascism and dictatorship. The way in which the people's democracy is being subverted by this purposeful cartel, undermining good governance, eroding accountability, and promoting misrule, points to how those who subvert it will govern South Africa should they succeed. And I think that's why I've said we must make sure that these characters never come close to the levers of power. The statement continues and says, after a century of struggle for liberty, South Africa cannot return to the totalitarian order that brought such misery and suffering to its people. Our future as a democracy, and it now speaks to us, is only as secure as our refusal to tolerate the destabilization of the state and our unyielding defense of the Constitution. We have a responsibility to make sure that as the reports are released, we make sure we campaign to ensure that the recommendations are acted upon, people who need to be charged are charged. It's our responsibility. And the statement goes on to say, the foundational creed of this nation and the supreme law of the land, that is the Constitution, is the basis on which we need to act. We therefore, and I quote, call on all people of goodwill to vigorously oppose this threat to our democracy and to defend the abiding values enshrined in our Constitution. As civil society, we need to gear ourselves to make sure that the government does what it needs to do, Parliament needs to do what it needs to do, and the governing party does what it is supposed to do. Because if you are a governing party, you have got a greater responsibility in terms of what happens in government. Our responsibility is to make sure that those who need to do it, do it. But at the same time, we need to be aware that, as somebody said, they're not going to go down without fighting back. And it is our responsibility to make sure we don't create space for them to fight back. And they can't kill all of us. The nation should stand. And as we said in DOD, the people shall be the last line of defense for this country. Thank you.
Thank you, Rev. Frank. And I think you have left us with some powerful thoughts to consider as we try and rebuild our country, and also as we anticipate what is to unfold in the next two reports. And I think what you are saying ties up quite nicely with what Professor William Gumede from the Wits School of Governance said last night when they had a similar webinar around the decay of governance and ethical leadership within public sector. And he said similar sentiments to what you were saying around the people being the last defense, and that there needs to be a strong social movement that, you know, reacts with dissent to what happened in the state capture project, but also that we need to put very strong mechanisms in place to really prevent capture from ever happening again, or even if it were to happen, it wouldn't happen at such a grand and large scale. So just before we get to the Q&A session, I think we've been left with quite a lot to think about as members of the public as well as civil society. And I think that, you know, it's very important that we don't lose sight of the fact that there is, or yeah, there is actually, not that, state capture has ended. There is a lot at play here, and there has been a very sinister network between corrupt official within the public sector and private sector who have left us in this mess, and that it is up to us to make sure that we come together, organize ourselves in our communities, in our sectors, and to get those who can put these people in a position to account, to be prosecuted and perhaps be arrested, and that reparations are made, and that the state can, somewhat recover some of the monies lost from corruption, that these things happen. And I just want us to go back to our spaces, in our communities, in our civil society organizations, in our places of work, to really think about how dire we find out, how dire the situation has been, and how we can rebuild our country going forward. So I'm going to open the Q&A session, and I hope that people in the YouTube platform as well as the Zoom can submit questions. We have about 45 minutes to do a Q&A. So I'm going to take a few questions, and then we can try and get members of our panelists to respond. And the first one is to you, Hennie. The first question is on the importance of recognizing the global links to capture and tackling capture. One example of how this was taken up was by Corruption Watch, who took on McKinsey in the US on their alleged involvement. Is there scope for this kind of work in relation to Bain and other international firms or individuals based in other countries? Is this how shareholders can begin to feel the pinch?
Yeah, thanks, Duret-san. I think that the work that Corruption Watch did on McKinsey was really important at the time. And I think that what they benefited from, of course, as well as in the United States, is that the Department of Justice was very interested in pursuing some of these issues. And I think that where there are opportunities for those kind of things, I think that's precisely what we should be doing. We should make it harder for those companies to be able to remove their actions from in countries like South Africa, from where their headquarters are. So, for a company like Bain, I think that they need to feel the heat all the way back, if I'm right, it's until Chicago, where the headquarters are, and the same applies very much for the global companies. And I think we're going to be coming to a similar situation when it comes to HSBC. And I think we will see in the Transnet section in particular, the very central role that HSBC as a global bank played in the looting of Transnet, amongst others. So, yeah, I think the short answer is yes. I think the difficult part is that you in part going to need institutions on that side who one is able to work and collaborate with. But equally, what we do want to do is to see our institutions work. And I think what we need to be cautious of, I'm not suggesting that we need to become narrow in our perspective in saying that we can't look at global or remedies in other countries. But ultimately, we want a functional a system of governance in a country like South Africa that upholds not only something amorphous called the rule of law, but I think was as Reverend Frank was saying, now we want to be able to see that there's an affirmation of those constitutional values in different ways. And that's going to mean that we need the criminal justice agencies in our country to work hard at doing that. And so, I keep on coming back to the first port of call must in fact be ensuring that those institutions that we fund as taxpayers are not only taxpayers, but people living in South Africa. Every one of us are paying tax in different ways, are working effectively. So yes, let's go to Washington and let's go to London and let's go to Hong Kong if we need to hold some of these companies to account. But in the face of institutions that claim that they are no longer captured, because certainly that was the case of the NPA under Sean Abrams. It was captured by a gang of people that were very close to another gang of people that had captured the state. Then the question is, if you are not going to fix it now, then who will ever do anything to right some of these wrongs? So I think I'm urging some balance to say that it is about ensuring that these institutions of ours work and they do the things that we require of them to do. And where there are opportunities, sure, let's go after them in other places. But ultimately, if we are successful in prosecuting companies like these in a country like South Africa, we set an extraordinary example, not only to other countries with much deeper pockets than ours, to show what a functioning democracy looks like, but it's precisely what we do in terms of the prosecution of Jacob Zuma and the company Thales for its role in the arms deal that lined the pockets of politicians during a previous dispensation. It sends the message to those corporations that there's nowhere to hide. And if you come and bring those practices that are normal where you operate into countries like ours, we will spend 20 years, but we will eventually go after you and you will be brought to justice. And I think that's an important element of what we need to be doing here.
Thank you for that. And then maybe just one small question to you, Hennie, and then we'll move on to questions directed to Rebecca and Rev Frank. Can we make citizen arrests?
Well, wouldn't that be nice? I'll see you all in Sandton at 5:30, but I'm not sure if we'll start at Sandton Square and then everybody just go in any direction because find a glass building because there's somebody waiting, an accountant, a lawyer, or a banker who's at the head of a company. But I mean, I think it's a fair question for all of us of what is it that we're able to do. And I don't think, unfortunately, in terms of the kind of crimes that we're talking about, one of the things that corporations do, and I think I'm talking specifically, I mean, I'll leave it to Rebecca and to Reverend Frank maybe to talk about some of the individuals who are implicated. But when it comes to corporations, the way in which corporations operate is it's often an in tandem cooperation between an auditor, a banker, and a lawyer. And then even within the banks, while the directors know about what's going on, they make sure that there are junior partners who get their hands dirty and effectively are thrown under the bus when the moment is appropriate. So it's quite hard for us to ensure that there are those kind of citizens arrests. But what we can do through the state, and I must stress, the state isn't an object outside of our control as citizens, is we should be saying to the NPA, well, why are you not going after these individuals in those corporations and who are within state-owned enterprises, and ensure that that you use the Companies Act, which is a tool that is relatively uncomplicated, in order to ensure that you are holding these individuals to account, who in their roles as the members of boards of these big corporations, or of the both private and public, were complicit in state capture. Now, the NPA doesn't do that. We heard that the Zondo Commission report said that we've only in the last 15 years had one prosecution under the Public Finance Management Act and one under the Prevention and Combating of Corrupt Activities Act. We are not even prepared to grapple with the so-called low-hanging fruit of using the Companies Act to be able to go after certain directors. And the National Director of Public Prosecutions, we've had some civil society meetings with her where she has, after we asked her questions about this, affirmed that she knows about those kind of instruments. And she said, that's a jolly good idea. Why don't we do this? Well, it was 18 months ago, and I guess they're still kind of mulling over what to do next. But, you know, I think that there are things that are at our disposal. I would argue that the moment we start saying that we must go and arrest CEOs, as kind of delicious as that sounds, but it's an indication of our deep frustration with the failings of public institutions. And I think that I trust that the National Director and others are listening very carefully to that, because you know, this is really the impact of us not achieving justice for the institutions we've created that are supposed to do that.
Thank you for that, Hennie. And then a question to you, Rebecca. Can we anticipate a fight back from those implicated, for instance, Bain and Co.? And already, I mean, they're already saying that their role has been mischaracterized. So the question is, can we expect lengthy court battles lodged by those implicated? And along with that, should we be looking at private prosecutions for those implicated in the state capture report? You are muted. Can you hear? Rebecca, I think you are muted.
Hi, I should be unmuted now. So I don't know enough about the legal framework around private prosecutions to contribute very intelligently on that, but I do know that private prosecutions can only be pursued once the NPA has released a certificate of null prosecute, which means that they have affirmed that they will not be pursuing that prosecution, which seems highly unlikely to me that they would take any such rash step, particularly at this stage, where they have the leadership of the NPA has openly said, you know, that they are still looking into various aspects relating to state capture and the like. With regards to Bain, I suppose one of the difficulties is that leadership of corporations tends to change. And then the question is to what degree we hold corporations responsible, as it were, for the sins of the father, which is a much wider and really quite a thorny ethical moral problem. It is enraging, I would say, that the likes of Vittoria Massone, we had an article about this in the Daily Maverick last week by my colleague Ferry O'Hafferty. We know that Vittoria Massone from Bain has gone on to take another key job in Europe without any apparent repercussions for what he did in South Africa, and whether that is a result of, you know, a lack of knowledge by his new employers. We don't know, but it is obviously enraging that that would be the case, that there doesn't seem to be any accountability there for those individuals. For others, the issue would be that they have moved on from roles. So in the case of Dudu Myeni and Yake Kwinana, for instance, they are no longer directors of companies, and the Zondo Commission made, I thought, quite a novel suggestion, which is that Parliament should change kind of the statute of limitations on declaring delinquent directors to enable people like Kwinana and Myeni to be declared delinquent retrospectively, which would then forbid them from becoming directors ever again. And that would be the kind of step that I think could be introduced quite profitably. I just wanted to say one more thing, if you'll allow me, Dudu, which is kind of in regards to what Hennie was saying about the NPA's relative lack of action, and that is that the suggestion by Zondo that there should be a special creation of an anti-corruption agency, which would involve tribunal, a court, an inspectorate, etc. It seems to me that those suggestions are fanciful at a time when the NPA itself is so clearly under-resourced or lacks the political will and muscle to really go after the existing cases with any particular appetite. And as Hennie said, with the apparent collapse of the investigative directorate. So it seems to me that our resources would perhaps be better spent on bulking up the existing mechanisms rather than simply trying to implement endless new kind of units to tackle that kind of prosecution. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Rebecca. And then a question for you, Reverend Frank, two maybe. Is government capable of implementing the recommendations of the State Capture Commission report? If not, what must be done by ordinary people? And tied to that, we've also seen recent reports about how PRASA has now purchased trains that are not conducive to our railway lines. This rings so similar to the previous, the previous 1,064 locomotives deal. It is clear that government inefficiency, capture, and corruption continue. What do you think needs urgently? What do you think needs urgent arrest through the ongoing forms of capture?
Yeah, the second question was quite convoluted, so you must untangle that. In terms of the first question, and I've heard our colleagues speaking partly on those matters, I think we need to accept the fact that state capture has not ended, and that there are people who are still in critical positions within government who are compromised and will make sure that prosecutions are delayed or don't happen. And so we shouldn't expect miracles from the NPA because it's not yet cleaned up wholly. And my view is that the few who are committed need to be encouraged to work hard, take the risk, because there's also a risk to prosecutors as well. But I would argue that we should still consider, and I know this matter has been said to be difficult, we need to say to the NPA that if you are not able to prosecute and you don't have the capacity, allow private prosecution to happen. So you don't keep cases for years when you can't prosecute and keep on saying, I'm going to prosecute. And I think just a threat to prosecute privately would be good enough to make sure that those who have committed these crimes know they're not going to go away with it by capturing the state and then making sure that they are not charged. So that's my view. I know we've discussed this matter, and people have said it's very difficult, it's very expensive. Others have suggested, I'm not a lawyer, that you can prepare the cases and give them to the NPA ready-made to say, charge them. Here's the evidence. Produce a charge sheet, for instance, and give it to them and say, this is what we believe you should do. In terms of government in general, we have to force government to do it. And that's where the people come in. And somebody in the chat said, the people are hungry and they're not going to get into campaigns of this nature because they need food. That's what they need. And so how are they going to stand against these elements? My view is that we should let the majority of the people in this country, particularly the poor, to understand that they are poor because of those who captured the state and looted the resources of the state. And I think it can be presented in a way that the masses of the people would take it on. I've suggested within DOD that we should begin to take on the challenges ordinary people are facing at community level, so that they don't think we're just talking as an academic exercise, but that we are with them in their pain and suffering, and that's critical. On the second question, ma'am, you'll have to reformulate that to say, what do they, whoever asked the question, what do they want us to say about PRASA?
Sure. So what they were saying was, what do we need to do urgently to stop or arrest current forms of corruption?
Yeah, again, it goes back to us. For instance, there's no difficulty in mobilizing people of Soweto to say state capture and corruption has stopped the railways functioning in Soweto. People now rely on taxis, and the taxis are many times more expensive than the railways. And the labor movement is beginning to come into that space to say, this is punishing the workers. And so we've got angles from which we could take on this task and make sure our railways come back and that we as the people take care of our infrastructure. Remember that some of the infrastructure we lost is because a security company's tender got cancelled and they decided they're going to loot the resources of the state to prove a point. The whole station in Kliptown just disappeared. Kliptown station is not there. And we can't allow things like those in the country. And it affects the poor more. It's the same people who say, we are standing for the poor, but in fact, what they mean is stand for themselves.
Thank you, Reverend Chikane. And I think it ties up nicely with what Hennie said earlier around the social cost of state capture and how it's incumbent, I guess, on us as civil society to really use this as an anchor to try and get ordinary people to understand just how it affects them personally. So a question for Hennie, this one, I think perhaps is slightly different, but an important one maybe to tackle. This one is a question about capture and corruption during the apartheid era. Were the templates for corruption and capture designed back then? And what do we do about cases of corruption and capture that preceded and perhaps were out of the terms of reference of the Zondo Commission?
Yeah, thanks very much, Dudet Sang. And I think an important question, and I think a frustration that many of us had is that we wanted the Zondo Commission to have a far more broad-ranging remit. But the truth is, the more one looked at the volume of information it needed to deal with, the number of witnesses that were called, and the number of years that this has taken, and this is only, I mean, in a way, at Open Secrets where I work, we talk about this as the latest phase of state capture, because this game, isn't really old. I think many of us recognize that the game has been at play for a long time. And we shouldn't forget that we had an entire commission into the arms deal that was led by Judge Willie Siriti, which was a cover-up. In fact, the findings were thrown out by a judgment of the full bench of the South Gauteng High Court, which is an indication that that's also how commissions can play an active role in ensuring that the interests of power elites in corporations and politicians are looked after. But certainly in terms of this question around the blueprint from apartheid, I think I would concur that the system was obviously very different. We didn't live in a democracy. The intention to subvert and to take control of democratic institutions was not what took place during the apartheid system. And instead, the system itself was geared towards corruption. It was always about making sure that a small band of people benefited, and those were white people during that system. And particularly at the top of that pile, the white people who supported the National Party regime and their cohort of allies in places like South Africa and elsewhere around the world. But importantly, in terms of where we do see the linkages, we have very clear examples of corporations who benefited from the economic crimes of the later apartheid period. We at Open Secrets have done a lot of work around the role of banks in particular, that was central to ensuring that sanctions busting took place for the apartheid regime and moved about an amount of about 400 billion rand around the world for the apartheid regime. We have done that which Reverend Chikane has suggested we do, is that we have actually produced a docket. So we've taken the charge sheet to the NPA. Not only did we take that to authorities in Europe, where through interference with the Belgian government, the issue was smothered. We then took the entire docket of information that colleagues who I work with, lawyers, had prepared. We handed that to the NPA more than 15, 16 months ago now, and was handed to the National Director and to the head of the Investigative Directorate. And I can tell you where that is right now, because the people that were put in charge of the investigation themselves are implicated either in state capture or aiding and abetting the attempts to stop other investigations into apartheid era crimes. There's a Brigadier Kaba who works at the Hawks. The Hawks made him in charge of the investigation into apartheid banks. Brigadier Kaba, those who recognize his name will know that he is the person, amongst others, who held Flock Symington, the official from SARS, captive. So there's a person who's implicated in state capture. The advocate Pretorius, who has been a massive block at the NPA into investigations into the murders of and disappeared during apartheid, political prisoners and others. He was the person put in charge, was also linked to the investigation from the NPA side. And I use those names to make the point that these kind of so-called bottlenecks, coming back to this issue of state capture, there's all kind of people still within the state who have no interest in making sure that there's accountability of a whole range of crimes, whether it's the crimes of apartheid, economic crimes, the crimes involving the crimes that impacted directly the families of the murdered and disappeared, or for that matter, the crimes of state capture. And again, I think it comes back to the importance of ensuring that we have the right people in these positions to ensure that accountability is seen to be done, and that's regardless of who is involved in those crimes and whether they are contemporary or what we call historic, because ultimately the impact is still felt today.
Thank you, Hennie. And maybe this one can be answered by both Hennie and Rebecca. Should you look at reinstating the SARS high-risk investigating unit? And as I recall, I think that was called the rogue unit that was, that was effective, that was highly effective at some point and would have posed a threat to the intent on state capture.
Over to you, Rebecca.
I would like to go first. You're muted.
Thank you so much. I think, yes, absolutely, as regards SARS. The problem is, of course, that SARS has, in the interim, lost these extremely experienced individuals who had this wealth of institutional memory as well. Judo, I can't remember, did you ask the second part of the question about whether we should ratify the Ethical Universal Gold Treaty as a country? I don't know if you did, but just to say that one of the recommendations that Judge Zondo makes is that there should be a kind of code of conduct, a national charter against corruption. So there would be a code of conduct setting out ethical standards that people involved in public procurement would have to sign and agree to uphold those standards. I mean, call me cynical, but it strikes me again that it is fanciful to expect that a kind of binding on your conscience obligation would do much to prevent the kind of systemic rot that we've seen happen in state capture, even judging by the fact that members of the executive could come before Judge Zondo in a judicial commission of inquiry and by Judge Zondo's own account lie quite freely under oath. It strikes me as unlikely that expecting people to be bound by a kind of moral code, unfortunately, would be as effective as one might hope. Thanks.
Hennie, do you have any additions?
No, maybe just the one point to say is that I think not only is it, I mean, other than the high risk unit, it's just generally the point around making SARS more effective. I think that needs to, there have been some moves in that direction, but I think it is something that we should all be applying our minds to all the time, as well as changes to laws. There are, at the moment, there are proposals around the changes to the amendments to the Companies Act. I think we all want to be able to see a publicly accessible list of beneficial owners. We want to know who owns all those companies around the world, partly because as citizens, we need to better be able to undertake investigations to expose the corporations who are involved in economic crime and simply don't pay their taxes or don't pay enough tax. And I think we need to see the act of not paying by very wealthy individuals and corporations of not paying sufficient tax, shifting offshore. There's a reason why everybody loves Mauritius right now. That kind of behavior, I think we need to be linking, like we do state capture, directly to the inequity and the social injustice we see around us.
Thank you, Rebecca and Hennie. I do see a hand up by Prof. Barney Pityana. Do you want to come in, Prof? Maybe short 30-second question.
Thank you very much. Thank you, colleagues, and thank you for all the contributions that were made. I really just want to show the spotlight in and emphasize a different part of what was alluded to everywhere. It seems to me that until and unless we can address the character and the nature of who we are as South Africans, there is always a likelihood that a history will repeat itself. For example, I mean, I can think of no country in the world where 2 or 3 people would get off the plane from India with a briefcase and end up having dinner or lunch with the president of the country in no time. It rarely happens anywhere in the world like that, to the extent of being the kind of powerful people that they had become. The second thing that I think we need to understand is that, in truth, we have a government that we what is the word I wanted to use? We have a government that we, come on, Rebecca, deserve. We have a government that we deserve at all levels. So basically, the people of South Africa have outsourced their power and their ideas about what kind of government they want in a democratic system to the government that actually has consistently been acting against their interests. So in a sense, I think that we need to come back and say to ourselves, why is it that these things happen? They happen, I think, because by and large in society, we've lost a large element of the moral fiber, or even any sense of who we are as people, as human beings. We've allowed ourselves to be treated and dealt with as if we're not human. And in many respects, we have enabled everything that has actually taken away our power, either politics or whatever else is happening around us. And it seems to me that any campaign that we have should just as much be a campaign about building a civil society base that is very, very conscious of itself, conscious of its power, conscious of its ability to actually truly shape the society they want. When I think for a moment, because Frank is here, I think for a moment about the UDF in its time. What clearly was a civil society movement of men and women, it wasn't everybody, of men and women who had come to the point that the system that we had can no longer, whatever the cost, can no longer continue to do what it was doing. We don't have that today. We don't have such a civil society consciousness among us. We do not have it. And it seems to me that these things happen because it is easy to manipulate, because we've become a very materialistic, elitist, grabbing kind of people. We think about ourselves. We don't really think about the purpose for our existence. So I'm trying to say that it doesn't matter what we do, unless we really work at the kind of people that we are in South Africa, the worst of the things that we're talking about may yet happen. I don't believe that, for example, when at the height of the worst things, including the matter of rape, the amount of people who actually went out proudly supporting Jacob Zuma and seeking to bring down parliament, the courts, for the purpose of somebody who had done that. And then on top of that, that person gets elected president of the country. What do you expect? That's what was going to happen. Jacob Zuma did what we gave him the key to do. So the real question is, how do we stop it? How do we make sure that it does not happen again? I think it will be, by and large, a big step in that direction if we create a critical mass of people among ourselves who will not participate in corruption, who will not allow bribery that happens on the streets, who will report wrongdoing wherever they see it, who will assist the law enforcement agencies whenever they see corruption or wrongdoing. All of these things at the moment are enabled by us, who tend to cast a blind eye or look away or do nothing, or in fact, participate in the wrongdoing that we know. It happens everywhere. It is very, very predominant in South Africa. It is very easy to look at so-called foreigners or Nigerians, whoever you call them. But ultimately, all of these things happen. with our neighbors, in our communities, in our homes. They happen because we've allowed them to happen.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof. I think we're just going to take the last 5 minutes to just wrap up. And perhaps maybe we'll start with the first speaker, Rebecca. If you could just give us your summarizing thoughts on state capture or closing remarks. You're muted.
Thanks very much, Dudu. I think I should speak probably just as a representative of the media here, because I recognize to some degree it is our quite weighty responsibility to communicate the findings of the Zondo Commission in a way that is accessible to the public and in a way that is readable, etc. And we are doing our best. And I think the coverage of the first report has in general been excellent. And just to note, the journalists are still working their way through the documents that were submitted to the Zondo Commission as accompanying affidavits and so forth. I would just say though, and this is to echo some of what Professor Chikane and the Reverend Chikane have said, that we do face obviously a very intense backlash from certain sectors, to the extent where, you know, every expose of wrongdoing or corruption that we can publish on Daily Maverick will be accompanied by a chorus of voices disdaining us as representatives of white monopoly capital, as the mainstream media, and so forth. And to some degree, unfortunately, these voices are now amplified by traditional respected media outlets in certain cases. Social media obviously has its own challenges in this regard. We see, you know, the likes of Machela Koko or Brian Molefe and their supporters claiming that there was no load shedding under Molefe, that SARS never worked better than under Moyane. And if we, as the media, were to take these claims seriously, we could spend our entire lives just fact-checking the kind of counter-information campaigns that are run at this moment by those who contributed to state capture and their supporters. So it's a very big problem that we in the media face, and we are conscious of it. And I think we do understand the responsibility that's also on us in terms of making sure that an 826-page report, that the findings of that make their way to the people who need it most, which are, you know, the members of the public whose money is being squandered. Thanks so much, Dudu.
Thanks so much, Rebecca. Hennie, over to you.
Yeah, Duretsang, I mean, I think the first point maybe to raise is that this isn't the final word on the matter. Not only this report, there are more to come, but I think that we need to recognize that the Zondo Commission is making an excellent contribution to our understanding of the issue, but they're not going to get everything right. And it's okay for us to say that without undermining the work of the Deputy Chief Justice and his commission. And we've used examples where we think they've gone soft on corporations. And I think it's okay for us to say when that happens and to be able to do that critically, because we want to see accountability of all power, the powerful, whether they're corporates or individuals in this country. Secondly, I would argue that the issue of corruption and state capture, we're not looking at this as I think Reverend Chikane was, pointing us in the direction, but we're not looking at this as a kind of a backward, as a phenomenon looking backward that's past, as in we're scientists or historians going through the archive. The networks are alive, and there are people that are still involved in activity that, that is more than just questionable. And quite frankly, let's say it, in December, we had recordings of the president of this country in a meeting with his political party leaders, in which he said that he will put the interests of the party above those of the country. He has sworn an oath to the Constitution, President Ramaphosa. And when we hear that kind of thing, it happened in December, sure, and it makes some people feel uncomfortable. But when I think I'm not going to use that word treason right away, but there are certain questions here that need to be asked, hard questions. of politicians when we hear them say that there are things that are just too tricky to deal with in the public domain, or if I do that, I'll bring down a party. And I raise that to say that I think we need to remain very vigilant of the way in which the interests of the powerful, of whether they're political parties, of corporations or individuals, are treated vis-a-vis the impact that their actions have on ordinary folk and working class people in a country like South Africa. And I think that our bias always needs to be on the side of people that are impacted by these crimes, and not by individuals who tell us it's tricky, it's complicated, give us more space and time. The time is now, and we need to see action. And I think that's the pressure we need to keep on state institutions going forward. Thanks.
Thank you, Hennie. Reverend Frank?
You tempted me to talk more, and I'm not going to do it because it's actually makes one angry that we have allowed what has happened to happen. It happened under our watch. You know, we didn't have to wait for a commission of inquiry to come and tell us this story. We knew about it. And we also know that there's a huge machinery out there of propaganda, distorting information, making those who defend the Constitution look like they are the sellouts, and those who violate the Constitution and the law are the heroes in this country. I mean, you see it in social media and other places. We allow it to happen. I wish my comrade Bani Pichana, I wish we were still 28 years old, you know, to be able to take on this challenge, because when we decided we're not going to allow the apartheid system to go on at our expense and causing so much damage and dehumanizing us, we took a stand. Lots of our people, our colleagues died, many were tortured, some ended up in exile, some in jail. There's no easy way of, just as middle class, and I know my colleagues in DOD know that I have a critique about this, that we can't think that just making statements and having discussions amongst ourselves is going to make a difference. We're going to have to mobilize the people on the ground, not the handful of middle-class people who can, you know, have a conversation and go back home. There are people out there who have no food, who have no train, who have no, you know, water, and the budgets have been consumed by individuals who are living in luxury. I think until people become angry about this thing and take a stand and go township to township, community from community, that's what we did. People didn't mobilize themselves in that regard. So we have a much more bigger task to defeat this system. And I'm hoping that we'll have more and more younger people who will take a stand to make sure it does not happen, doesn't continue. Thank you very much. I don't want to say more because I'm quite convinced that we can stop this thing. And as I said, we told them they can kill all of us, they can kill as many of us as possible, but we're going to stop the apartheid system. And we did. We can stop this. It's not difficult.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Reverend Frank. And just in closing, as we are at the end, I just want to thank our amazing panelists for today's session. I think it has been quite informative, and it's given us a lot to think about as civil society as well as ordinary members of society. And then I also would like to make a special thank you to some whistleblowers who have taken the time to join in on this webinar. One that I saw was Cynthia Stimple, who exemplifies what good citizenry and being a public servant is. and just to thank her for her presence today. And if I have missed the others, we also would like to thank you and recognize the work that you have done and the contribution that you've done to our country and to us getting to know better what state capture really is and its implication for our country. With that said, everybody, thank you so much for coming through to our webinar. We will see you in the second one. Take care. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.